For decades, the world was handed a version of Bruce Lee that was simple, repeatable, and profitable. A version that fits neatly into headlines and film reels. They told us he was just speed, just aggression, just a man who fought fast and moved faster, a movie icon defined by spectacle, reduced to moments that could be sold, replayed, and applauded without asking deeper questions. That version traveled everywhere. It filled posters, interviews, documentaries, and casual conversations. It became so familiar that no one stopped to wonder what was missing, and when a story is repeated long enough, it stops sounding like a story and starts feeling like truth. But that image was never the whole man, because the real Bruce Lee did not live for noise or display. He was not built around performance or image. His power did not come from what people saw, but from what they never noticed. From restraint instead of aggression, from awareness instead of reaction, from depth instead of spectacle. That truth was quieter, more demanding, and far less comfortable than the myth that replaced it. It could not be packaged easily. It could not be explained in a highlight reel, and it did not benefit those who wanted a simple legend instead of a complex human being, so it was ignored. And what you are about to hear is the part of Bruce Lee's story that was never meant to be loud enough to survive the myth. From the very beginning, the public image of Bruce Lee was shaped less by who he truly was, and more by what people wanted him to be. Audiences wanted excitement, not complexity. Studios wanted a clear symbol, not a layered human being. Media wanted a story that could be told quickly, understood instantly, and repeated endlessly. In that environment, nuance had no value, but spectacle did. So Bruce Lee was gradually molded into something simpler than reality. He became the fast one, the explosive one, the man of speed, sharp sounds, and dramatic motion. His image was built around moments that looked impressive in isolation, moments that could be clipped, replayed, and sold without explanation. Over time, those moments replaced the man himself. The highlights became the identity, and the deeper foundation beneath them disappeared from view. This transformation did not happen because people were malicious. It happened because the myth was convenient. A simple story travels faster than a complex truth. A symbol is easier to remember than a philosophy. The idea of Bruce Lee as pure physical power fit neatly into entertainment culture, where meaning is often secondary to impact. The more he was reduced to motion and speed, the easier he was to market. What was lost in that process was the discipline behind the speed, the restraint behind the intensity, the hours of reflection, reading, writing, and self-questioning that shaped his decisions long before they ever shaped his movements. Bruce Lee did not arrive at his abilities by accident or instinct alone. He built them deliberately, through years of internal work that never appeared on posters or screens. The myth presented Bruce Lee as a man who overwhelmed situations with force. The truth was that he approached life with analysis. He studied systems, questioned traditions, and refused to accept ideas simply because they were popular or established. He did not see power as something to display, but as something to understand. Yet understanding is slow, subtle, and difficult to dramatize, so it was left out. Over time, repetition turned the simplified image into assumed truth. When people heard his name, they no longer thought of a thinker or a philosopher. They thought of speed, impact, and dominance. This was not entirely false, but it was incomplete, and incomplete stories are dangerous because they distort what people try to learn from them. The real Bruce Lee was not driven by the desire to look powerful. He was driven by the need to become precise. He believed that raw strength without awareness was unreliable, and that speed without clarity was reckless. His training was as much about removing excess as it was about adding skill. He constantly asked what was unnecessary, what was borrowed, and what did not truly belong to him. That process of stripping away illusion does not fit easily into a myth. Myths require certainty. They thrive on absolutes. Bruce Lee lived in questioning. He was willing to dismantle his own beliefs if they no longer served truth. He rejected rigid systems not because he lacked discipline, but because he valued honesty more than tradition. The convenient myth ignored this inner struggle. It presented Bruce Lee as complete, finished, and fully formed. In reality, he never saw himself that way. He viewed growth as ongoing and mastery as something that could never be finalized. This discomfort with final answers made him difficult to categorize, so the culture around him chose a simpler version instead. By focusing only on power, the myth also misled people about what made Bruce Lee dangerous in the first place. It was not his ability to strike quickly, it was his ability to think clearly under pressure. It was his refusal to be governed by ego, expectation, or fear. Those qualities do not look impressive on screen, but they decide outcomes long before action ever occurs. The lie was not that Bruce Lee possessed power. He did. The lie was that power was the most important thing about him. That belief shifted attention away from the qualities that actually defined his approach to life: awareness, discipline, self-honesty, adaptability. These traits were harder to imitate, harder to sell, and harder to explain, so they were quietly pushed aside. As a result, generations grew up admiring a surface-level version of Bruce Lee, while missing the deeper invitation his life represented. They tried to copy his movements instead of his mindset. They focused on speed instead of clarity. They admired the image without engaging the process that created it. The myth survived because it was easy. The man beneath it was demanding. To understand Bruce Lee fully, one has to confront uncomfortable questions about self-control, identity, and discipline. One has to accept that strength without awareness is incomplete, and that mastery begins internally, not externally. That is why the myth replaced the man. It asked nothing from the audience except admiration. The truth would have asked them to change. And that truth was never convenient. One of the most persistent misunderstandings about Bruce Lee is the belief that he lived for confrontation. The public image suggests a man constantly ready to fight, eager to prove dominance, and always searching for the next challenge. This idea feels believable because it aligns with how he was portrayed on screen and how combat culture often celebrates aggression. But this version of Bruce Lee misunderstands his relationship with fighting at a fundamental level. Bruce Lee did not study fighting because he loved violence. In fact, unnecessary conflict unsettled him. He saw fighting as a serious matter, not entertainment. For him, combat was a laboratory where human behavior under pressure could be observed, understood, and refined. Fighting was a tool for study, not an obsession for validation. He was far more interested in what happens before a fight than in the fight itself. Fear, hesitation, ego, overconfidence, and misjudgment fascinated him. He noticed how people lost control mentally long before they lost physically. In his view, by the time fists were thrown, the outcome was often already decided by the state of the mind. This is why his training focused so heavily on awareness and self-regulation rather than aggression. Bruce Lee believed that the highest form of mastery was not defeating others, but mastering oneself. This idea guided everything he did. He trained to remove emotional reactions, not to amplify them. He wanted to understand how to remain clear when pressure distorted perception. To him, a person who sought fights was often someone trying to resolve an internal conflict externally. This belief placed him at odds with many expectations. In environments where toughness was measured by willingness to fight, his restraint was misinterpreted. People assumed that if he did not rush toward confrontation, he must be avoiding it. In reality, he was evaluating whether it was necessary at all. Bruce Lee did not believe every challenge deserved a response. He was deeply aware of how ego drives conflict. Many fights begin not from necessity, but from insecurity. A look is misread. A comment is taken personally. Pride demands reaction. Bruce Lee trained himself to step outside this pattern. He refused to let ego dictate his behavior, even when provoked. This refusal confused people who equated readiness with aggression. His discomfort with unnecessary conflict was not weakness. It was discipline. He understood the cost of violence, both physically and psychologically. Engaging in conflict meant accepting consequences, and he did not take that lightly. He believed that true strength included the ability to walk away without feeling diminished. This perspective did not fit the image people wanted. A man who studies restraint is harder to glorify than a man who rushes into battle. The idea that Bruce Lee valued self-control over domination did not align with the narrative of the fearless fighter who always seeks confrontation. So that part of his character was quietly minimized. Bruce Lee's philosophy emphasized responsibility. He believed that skill without judgment was dangerous. Knowing how to fight carried an obligation to know when not to. This principle guided his conduct and shaped his training. He did not romanticize violence. He respected its seriousness. He also understood that constant fighting dulls awareness. When conflict becomes habitual, reactions replace decisions. Bruce Lee avoided this trap by remaining selective. He treated confrontation as something to be understood, not indulged. This selectivity preserved clarity and prevented him from becoming reactive. The myth of Bruce Lee as a man obsessed with fighting oversimplifies his intentions. It suggests that his identity was built around conflict, when in reality his identity was built around refinement. He wanted to remove what was unnecessary, including unnecessary battles. What made Bruce Lee formidable was not eagerness to fight, but the ability to remain calm in its presence. He did not need to prove himself repeatedly, because his confidence did not come from external outcomes. It came from internal alignment. He trusted his preparation and did not seek validation through confrontation. This truth is less exciting than the myth, but far more instructive. It challenges the idea that strength must always be displayed. It suggests that mastery includes restraint, judgment, and responsibility. These qualities are harder to imitate and harder to celebrate, which is why they were overshadowed. Bruce Lee was not obsessed with fighting. He was obsessed with understanding himself, understanding others, and understanding the conditions that lead to conflict. Fighting was only one part of that study, and not the most important one. By removing this truth from his story, the myth turned him into something simpler than he was. It removed the depth of his discipline and replaced it with a shallow image of aggression. But when you look closely, it becomes clear that Bruce Lee's real strength came from his refusal to be ruled by the need to fight. That refusal was not avoidance. It was mastery. Long before Bruce Lee became known for speed, technique, or physical ability, his primary focus was the mind. This part of his life was rarely highlighted because it did not fit the image people expected. The world prefers visible effort over invisible discipline, and mental training is often misunderstood as secondary. For Bruce Lee, it was the foundation of everything else. He read constantly, not casually, but intensely. Philosophy, psychology, self-development, Eastern thought, Western logic, and personal journals filled his daily life. He was not reading to collect quotes or sound intelligent. He was reading to challenge himself. He wanted to understand why people think the way they do, why fear overrides logic, and why ego blinds judgment. His physical training was important, but it followed mental clarity, not the other way around. Bruce Lee believed that most limitations begin in the mind. People hesitate before they fail, they doubt before they lose, they surrender internally long before anything external forces them to stop. This belief shaped how he trained and how he lived. He did not see combat as a test of strength alone, but as a test of perception, decision-making, and emotional control. He observed how quickly fear narrows awareness. Under pressure, people fixate on one outcome and ignore everything else. Bruce Lee trained himself to remain mentally open in those moments. He practiced awareness that did not collapse when stress increased. This ability to stay mentally flexible allowed him to adapt instead of freeze. Unlike many who followed rigid systems, Bruce Lee questioned structure itself. He did not reject tradition out of rebellion, but out of honesty. If something worked, he kept it. If it didn't, he discarded it, regardless of its reputation. This approach required confidence, but more importantly, it required humility. He accepted that no system was complete, including his own. His focus on the mind also made him deeply self-critical. He did not assume progress simply because he trained hard. He reflected constantly. He asked whether his actions aligned with his principles, whether his reactions were driven by clarity or ego, and whether his beliefs still served truth. This level of self-examination is uncomfortable, which is why many avoid it. Bruce Lee embraced it. What people often mistake as confidence in Bruce Lee was actually clarity. He knew what he believed and why he believed it, but he remained open to change. That balance is rare. Most people cling to certainty for comfort. Bruce Lee was willing to live with uncertainty if it meant growth. He believed that stagnation begins the moment someone thinks they have arrived. This mental discipline was not visible on screen. Films cannot easily show thought, reflection, or internal struggle. They show motion. Because of this, audiences saw the result of his mental training, but not the process behind it. Speed looked impressive. Calm under pressure looked natural. Few realized how much deliberate mental work made those qualities possible. Bruce Lee also understood the danger of identification. He warned against attaching identity too tightly to labels, styles, or reputations. The moment someone becomes defined by an image, they stop evolving. He refused to let his name, his fame, or his abilities trap him into a fixed version of himself. He saw identity as fluid, something to be shaped rather than protected. This mindset extended beyond martial arts. He applied it to life. Relationships, creativity, learning, and self-expression were all areas where he practiced adaptability. He believed that rigidity, whether mental or physical, leads to failure. Flexibility, in his view, was not weakness. It was intelligence in motion. The mind-first approach also explains why Bruce Lee often appeared calm in situations that unsettled others. Calm was not accidental. It was trained. He had spent years observing his own reactions, understanding his emotional triggers, and refining his responses. When pressure arrived, he did not need to invent calm. He had already built it. People who encountered him sometimes underestimated this aspect. They saw relaxation and assumed lack of seriousness. They saw quiet and assumed detachment. In reality, he was deeply engaged, just not externally expressive. His attention was internal, precise, and continuous. This is why the myth of Bruce Lee as purely physical misses the essence of who he was. His body followed his mind and not the reverse. Every movement was informed by understanding. Every decision was guided by awareness. Without this mental foundation, his physical abilities would have been incomplete. Bruce Lee once suggested that knowledge without self-knowledge is hollow. This belief drove his constant study of the mind. He wanted to know not just how to act, but why he acted. This level of honesty is demanding. It requires facing flaws, contradictions, and limitations without excuse. That demand is uncomfortable for most people. It is easier to admire a legend than to confront the process that created him. It is easier to copy movement than to develop awareness. That is why this part of Bruce Lee's story is often overlooked. But when you understand that he studied the mind first, everything else makes sense. His restraint, his adaptability, his refusal to be boxed into a single identity, his calm under pressure. None of it was accidental. The real Bruce Lee was not built in the gym alone. He was built in reflection, questioning, and mental discipline. And without understanding that, the rest of the story will always feel impressive but incomplete. Bruce Lee was often misunderstood by the very people who trained with him, observed him closely, or considered themselves experienced in combat. This misunderstanding did not come from a lack of exposure, but from expectation. Many believed that seriousness must look intense, that readiness must appear tense, and that confidence must be displayed outwardly. Bruce Lee challenged all of these assumptions simply by being himself. He did not move through the world with constant tension in his body or urgency in his behavior. He could appear relaxed, quiet, even detached, especially in situations where others felt the need to prove something. To those who equated pressure with preparedness, this calm felt unsettling. They assumed it meant lack of interest or lack of seriousness. In reality, it was the opposite. Bruce Lee conserved energy deliberately. He understood that constant projection of strength drains clarity. While others used posture and presence to intimidate or impress, he allowed his demeanor to remain natural. This made him difficult to read. People could not tell when he was evaluating, preparing, or deciding. That uncertainty often led them to underestimate him. Among peers, this created confusion. Some mistook his calmness for arrogance, others for indifference. A few believed he was hiding insecurity. These interpretations said more about the observers than about Bruce Lee himself. They revealed how dependent people are on familiar signals to assess capability. When those signals are absent, judgment becomes unreliable. Bruce Lee did not perform confidence because he did not need to. His confidence came from preparation, not from display. He trusted his understanding and his training, which allowed him to remain composed without effort. He did not rush to assert himself or establish dominance. He allowed situations to unfold and observed how others behaved within them. This patience often worked against expectations. In competitive environments, stillness is seen as hesitation. Silence is mistaken for uncertainty. Bruce Lee understood that these assumptions created blind spots. By not conforming to expected behavior, he disrupted how others evaluated him. He watched carefully. He noticed who relied on intimidation, who rushed decisions, who grew impatient when not acknowledged. He allowed others to expose their habits through repetition. This observation gave him insight that aggression never could. While peers tried to measure him, he was measuring them. Bruce Lee's discipline extended to his emotions. He did not let pride dictate his reactions. When challenged verbally or physically, he did not respond out of reflex. He evaluated necessity. This restraint confused people who believed that confidence demands immediate response. They interpreted his lack of reaction as avoidance rather than judgment. What they failed to recognize was that Bruce Lee did not see every challenge as meaningful. He did not believe that skill required constant demonstration. In his view, responding to every provocation diminished control rather than establishing it. This belief set him apart, but it also isolated him at times. Even among experienced practitioners, his refusal to conform to established behavior created resistance. Some dismissed his ideas because they did not fit tradition. Others rejected his methods because they challenged hierarchy. Bruce Lee accepted this misunderstanding as part of his path. He did not seek approval from peers who measured value through conformity. This misunderstanding often persisted until circumstances forced a reassessment. When people finally recognized the depth of his awareness and control, it came suddenly and without warning. The calm they had dismissed revealed itself as discipline. The quiet they had underestimated revealed itself as clarity. Bruce Lee never attempted to correct these misjudgments in advance. He understood that perception cannot be argued into change. It must be experienced. He allowed others to hold their assumptions until reality challenged them directly. This approach required patience and self-trust. It meant accepting temporary misunderstanding in exchange for long-term clarity. Bruce Lee chose that path consistently. He did not shape himself to meet others' expectations. He allowed his understanding to shape his behavior, regardless of how it was perceived. The result was a man who stood apart even among peers. Not because he sought separation, but because he refused to compromise awareness for acceptance. He knew that true mastery does not require recognition at the moment. It reveals itself when assumptions collapse. Bruce Lee was misunderstood because he did not look like what people expected mastery to look like. He was calm where others were tense, selective where others were eager, reflective where others were reactive. These differences created distance, but they also preserved his integrity. Misunderstanding did not weaken him. It protected him. It filtered out those who only valued appearances and revealed those who could recognize substance beneath restraint. Bruce Lee accepted being misunderstood because he understood something more important. Clarity does not depend on being recognized. And those who learned this too late discovered that calm was never the absence of strength. It was the discipline behind it. When Bruce Lee died, the opportunity to misunderstand him did not disappear. It multiplied. In the absence of a living voice to clarify, question, or correct, the story of who he was became even easier to reshape. Over time, the myth did not simply survive his death, it expanded beyond him, growing louder, cleaner, and more polished than reality ever was. Stories began to harden into certainty. Moments were exaggerated. Interpretations were repeated until they sounded factual. Complex experiences were simplified into dramatic narratives that fit neatly into documentaries, books, and conversations. The more these stories were repeated, the more they replaced the human being behind them. Bruce Lee became larger than life, but also flatter. What people remembered most were the elements that felt inspiring from a distance. His physical ability, his confidence, his iconic presence. These qualities were easy to admire without self-examination. They allowed people to celebrate him without asking uncomfortable questions about discipline, doubt, or inner struggle. What slowly disappeared were the parts of Bruce Lee that challenged people rather than entertained them. His philosophy was reduced to isolated quotes, removed from the context in which they were written. Sentences meant to provoke thought were turned into slogans meant to motivate. The depth behind his words was flattened into surface-level inspiration. This transformation made his ideas more accessible, but far less demanding. His struggles were polished away. Bruce Lee questioned himself constantly. He wrestled with uncertainty, identity, and limitations. He did not see doubt as failure, but as a signal to re-examine direction. These internal conflicts were essential to his growth, yet they were rarely included in the posthumous version of his story. A legend does not leave room for doubt. A human being does. The lie continued because certainty is more comfortable than complexity. It is easier to believe in a finished hero than in someone who is always in the process of becoming. Bruce Lee did not view himself as complete. He believed that reaching certainty too early was a form of stagnation. Growth, in his view, required constant reassessment. That perspective does not translate well into myth. After his death, Bruce Lee's image was often used to support ideas he himself would have questioned. Rigid interpretations of his philosophy appeared, even though he openly rejected rigidity. People claimed to follow his way while turning it into a fixed system. The irony of this was rarely acknowledged. The more his name was repeated, the less his mindset was understood. Another part of the lie was the removal of responsibility from his legacy. Bruce Lee did not want blind followers. He wanted individuals to think critically, adapt intelligently, and discover truth through direct experience. He warned against imitation without understanding. Yet after his death, imitation became the primary way people engaged with his legacy. They copied movements. They repeated phrases. They admired the image. Few engaged with the discipline required to question themselves the way he did. This selective remembrance made Bruce Lee safer to admire. A challenging thinker asks something from the audience. A polished legend asks nothing. The posthumous myth allowed people to feel inspired without feeling examined. Even his philosophy of adaptability was turned into something fixed. The idea of being fluid, open, and responsive was quoted endlessly, but rarely practiced. Bruce Lee believed that truth must be lived, not memorized. That distinction was often lost as his words were detached from his method. The lie persisted because it served many purposes. It preserved comfort. It simplified complexity. It allowed people to admire without effort, and it protected them from confronting the deeper implications of his life. The real Bruce Lee would not have wanted to be preserved in certainty. He would have wanted to be questioned. He believed that understanding must remain alive, not frozen. Turning him into a finished legend contradicted the very principles he lived by. What remained was a version of Bruce Lee that felt inspiring but distant, powerful but unreachable, admired but not truly understood. The human struggle, the constant refinement, the rejection of final answers were quietly removed. And in removing those elements, the story lost its most valuable lesson. Bruce Lee's greatness did not come from perfection. It came from process, from constant evaluation, from refusing to settle into a comfortable identity, from choosing growth over image, even when that meant being misunderstood. After his death, that process was replaced by a product. The lie did not continue because people wanted to deceive. It continued because myths are easier to hold than truths that demand change. A legend can be admired without discomfort. A human being who never stopped becoming asks the audience to do the same. That is why the lie grew stronger after Bruce Lee was gone. The truth was still there, but it required effort to see, and effort is what myths are designed to avoid. The most uncomfortable truth about Bruce Lee is not that he was unbeatable, extraordinary, or ahead of his time. It is that he never believed he had arrived. While the world prefers heroes who feel complete and finished, Bruce Lee rejected that idea entirely. He did not see mastery as a destination. He saw it as a continuous process of dismantling illusion, including his own. Bruce Lee believed that certainty was dangerous. The moment a person believes they fully understand themselves or the world, growth slows. Comfort replaces curiosity. He intentionally avoided that trap. Even at the height of his recognition, he questioned his methods, his beliefs, and his assumptions. This constant self-examination was not insecurity, it was discipline. The truth is harder to accept because it demands responsibility. If Bruce Lee had simply been a gifted fighter, then admiration would be enough. People could watch, applaud, and move on unchanged. But if his strength came from awareness, restraint, and relentless self-honesty, then the lesson becomes uncomfortable. It suggests that greatness is not inherited or accidental. It is built through effort most people avoid. He believed growth required uncertainty. Not knowing was not a weakness to him. It was an invitation to learn, where others sought fixed systems and clear answers. Bruce Lee sought understanding that could adapt to reality. He rejected rigid identities because they limit perception. He believed that truth must remain alive, flexible, and responsive. This is why he resisted being turned into a model to imitate. imitation. In his view, replaces understanding. Copying another person's movements or words may create the appearance of progress, but it avoids the harder work of self-discovery. Bruce Lee did not want followers who looked like him. He wanted individuals who thought for themselves. That truth challenges how people engage with his legacy. It asks more than admiration. It asks reflection. It asks discipline. It asks the courage to question one's own habits, beliefs, and assumptions. Most people prefer inspiration that feels safe and distant. Bruce Lee offered something far more demanding. He also believed humility was essential to mastery. Not humility as performance, but humility as openness. The willingness to admit ignorance, the willingness to change direction, the willingness to discard what no longer worked, even if it had once brought success. This mindset is uncomfortable because it offers no final resting place. Bruce Lee's life was not about building an image. It was about refining awareness. Every phase of his life reflected this process. He adapted, restructured, and evolved, often at personal cost. He accepted misunderstanding as part of growth. Approval was never his goal. Clarity was. The truth is harder to accept because it removes excuses. It shows that discipline is not glamorous, that progress is rarely visible, that the most important battles happen internally without witnesses. Bruce Lee's calm, restraint, and depth were the results of daily effort, not natural talent alone. He believed that stripping away illusion was more important than adding technique. Illusions about strength. Illusions about identity. Illusions about control. He wanted to see reality clearly, even when it challenged comfort. This clarity shaped how he trained, how he lived, and how he understood success. That is why the real Bruce Lee cannot be reduced to a myth without losing what made him significant. Myths offer certainty. Bruce Lee offered inquiry. Myths offer completion. Bruce Lee offered process. Myths ask for admiration. Bruce Lee asked for transformation. Accepting this truth means recognizing that his legacy is not something to be copied, but something to be practiced. Awareness over reaction. Understanding over assumption. Growth over image. These principles are demanding because they never end. Bruce Lee was unfinished by design. He chose a path that refused final answers. He believed that the moment someone stops questioning, they stop growing. That belief shaped his life far more than any single achievement ever could. And this is the truth they rarely share. Not because it is hidden, but because it asks more than most people are willing to give. Bruce Lee's greatest lesson is not about fighting, speed, or power. It is about honesty with oneself. And that lesson cannot be consumed passively. It must be lived. That is why the truth is harder to accept. And that is why it still matters. Bruce Lee was never meant to be admired as a finished legend. He was meant to be understood as a living process. A man who questioned himself relentlessly, rejected comfortable illusions, and chose awareness over image even when it made him harder to accept. They lied about him by turning him into something easy to admire and impossible to follow. The truth is more demanding. It asks for discipline instead of applause, clarity instead of certainty, and growth instead of imitation. Bruce Lee's real legacy is not what he showed the world, but what he expected from anyone who truly paid attention. And once you see that clearly, the myth is no longer enough.